intersection of this transformative program. Fantastic, indeed. So but that's the exception, perhaps, which proves the rule. That we rather have in the world a situation where economics is largely represented as a technical discipline with a set of answers to questions which society might pose for it, and which can often give a fairly determinate direction as to how society, and in particular the economy, which is imagined to be a distinct realm, should be organized so as to achieve desired ends. So although economists will give lip service to the idea that they're the experts called in by the prince to advise them on the implications of different possible choices, with the modest economist simply playing the role of providing the answers, the objective answers to these questions so that the prince can choose among them, it very often seems as if it's rather the opposite, that the economist is dictating to the prince what is called a Hobson's choice, namely the idea that there is a choice consisting of one element only, which must be chosen. You can have any Model T that you want, any color Model T, as long as it's black. And so similarly, you can organize your economy any way you wish, as long as it's this particular way. It can sometimes seem to be that that's the role that the economist plays. Now, at one of the INET conferences that I attended, there was a talk by Amartya Sen. It was in the early years of the Greek crisis. Now that it's gone on for so long, we can talk about the early years and the late years. In the early years of the Greek crisis, and it was a critique of the recommendation of austerity by economists. And in that particular lecture, Sen made the point, so Nobel Prize-winning economist, as you know, very much concerned with well-being, made the point that many economists, including some very well-known economists, are largely indifferent to the question of social well-being. And he gave the example of John Maynard Keynes as someone who had tended to take a rather narrow view of what well-being consisted in, at least. Now, of course, many of us think of Keynes as being a figure who was a liberal figure, maybe even bordering on being a leftist figure. Of course, for Keynes himself, it was very important to say that he was not a leftist, he was a liberal. He wrote an entire essay called Why I Am a Liberal, which is worth reading if you're in any doubt as to where Keynes stood. But I think Sen's critique of Keynes was that Keynes tended to take a very economistic view of what well-being consisted in. Certainly he was interested in employment and unemployment, and he saw tremendous waste around him, which caused human devastation in the Great Depression, and that was referred to in his writings. But in fact, it was the suggestion he didn't concern himself very much with the other bases of human well-being, whereas today we would take the view, I think many of us, as the human development reports or the Stiglitz-Sarkozy Commission on Economic Performance or others have done, that well-being has to be interpreted broadly and richly in terms of its diverse aspects and factors that contribute to it. Like having a clean air, having a rich cultural environment, having high quality of social relations, etc., are all important to well-being, not just having goodies, economic resources to spend on consumption on the aroma, much as there are opportunities for that here. Italian life also has many of those other things which should cause any Italian to contest the idea that Italy is performing poorly from that point of view, that richer point of view compared to other countries. But a friend of mine pointed out later to Sen, he happened to share the same airplane, so they talked, that the economic consequences of the peace, one of Keynes's earlier works, which provided a critique, a very harsh critique of the demand for reparations from Germany after the First World War, is full of references to well-being, or at least it has some prominent references to well-being in its broader aspects. And my friend later drew my attention to a specific passage about the Sudetenland and children wasting from malnourishment or undernourishment, rather, in the Sudetenland, then occupied territory of Germany, as a result of the economic conditions prevailing in the country. And of course, Keynes drew a broader broader conclusion from this, which is that this was dangerous economically and politically. And in fact, Keynes was a very prescient figure in seeing that there would be every danger of a recurrence of the kind of tensions which led to the First World War if this was not handled in a sensible and more permissive fashion. So in effect, he was combating the imposition of an austerity regime of a kind on Germany through reparations for reasons of political good sense as well as economic and social concern. Not very different from what Amartya Sen was advocating with respect to how Europe should approach Greece today, having a modicum of political sense as well as social concern in the mix, along with the demand for economic criteria to be satisfied. But of course, the truth is that the case for austerity in Greece or indeed elsewhere is not always simply an economic case. It's often presented in rather moralistic terms. Right? The lawyer's slogan, "Pacta sunt servanda," is what is presented. And the German public seem to have been nourished on a rich diet of "Pacta sunt servanda," rather than on the idea that one should make a pragmatic economic assessment of the conditions which are created. We were talking about Greece, in fact, of coffee break, so this is exactly what came up. And indeed, it is common around the world for creditors to undertake what they call a haircut, charming term, meaning debt relief, to accept losses. In the interest of pragmatism, they would rather pragmatically identify certain debts as being unlikely to be repaid and accept a loss on the nominal face value of those debts in order to ensure that they be actually paid as much as possible. And it's precisely that kind of economic pragmatism which seems to be lacking in this case. So it's partly a question of the tyranny of certain economic ideas, but also a question of the tyranny of certain moralistic and legal ideas in the context of a certain political culture, namely Germany. Because pragmatic capitalists on Wall Street take losses all the time. So it's not clear why pragmatic capitalists in Frankfurt can't take losses too. And in fact, I suspect some of them would, if they could, in this situation. But they're not being allowed to because of the politicized character of the debate. Now, the larger question that I would like to ask, and this is related to the current austerity debate, is the question of why debates about the sense, the good sense or not, of something like austerity seem to go on and on and on. Right? Not just this round of the debate, but subsequent rounds of the debate. Of course, there are innovations of different kinds that happen in the argument. For instance, some Italian economists who enjoy international stature recently made an argument which some people on the surface consider utterly absurd. Economists from Bocconi University and Harvard, Alberto Alcina being one of them, as you know. Namely, the idea that there could be such a thing as expansionary austerity, meaning that if you tighten your belt enough, then you will expand your tummy. Okay. So expansionary austerity turned out to become rather a fashionable idea in certain circles, because it promised you could have your cake and eat it too. You could have austerity in the short run, and then you could have expansion as a direct consequence of the longer term. That's not, by the way, what actually happened in Greece, for instance, where you had a contraction of the Greek economy much greater than anticipated according to the projections of the international lenders, which is one of the reasons for the inability of Greece, not the only reason, but one of the reasons for the inability of Greece to fulfill its demands from creditors today. There are lots of other reasons, many of which are also Greece is doing, needless to say, at least historically, in some sense. But the over-optimistic projections were based on a failure to recognize how contractionary austerity actually is, and And this is very much the fault of economists, presenting a certain notion of what could be expected or should be expected as if it was a technical truth that any reasonably minded economist would come to, when in fact there was a wide range of possibilities which had to be discussed and considered, much wider than the obfuscation of that fact by highly technical language from international institutions and processes suggested. So to return to my main question, why do these debates seem to go on and on? And let me make it clear exactly how much they go on and on. I don't know if anyone here has read the work of David Ricardo, the British economist of the 19th century, early 19th century. But David Ricardo had a famous debate with Thomas Malthus, another English economist of the time, which could only be described as a debate about austerity and expansion, or stimulus rather, austerity and stimulus. What is the appropriate reaction of government policy, or the appropriate stance of government fiscal policy in particular, in a context of underemployment of resources? And Keynes refers to this in the general theory. There's an appendix to the general theory where he talks about the debate between Malthus and Ricardo 120 years before the general theory on exactly this question. And Keynes, in essence, is asking the question, were there what another historian of economic thought, Don Patinkin, called anticipations of the general theory in the debate of Malthus and Ricardo? If there were, in fact, anticipations of the general theory of Malthus and Ricardo, that would, of course, be quite fascinating. But whether or not Keynes's general theory was anticipating, what was clearly present was a debate about what the government should do in this situation. Should it spend more? Should it spend less? Roughly 1820. So here's a debate which has gone on for 200 years. Nearing 200 years. And the question is, why has this debate not ended? There are debates in physics, chemistry, biology, subjects that economists sometimes look up to, right? Disciplines that economists look up to, because mainstream economists very often, certainly, will model themselves as scientists, and they're not shy about using the language of science, not in the rich sense you have it in Italian. I believe in Italian, when you speak of science, it's systematic discipline, discipline, knowledge creation. It's not science in the narrow sense of natural science as it's used today in English. Similarly, in French and German, the notion of science is much richer and broader. But when economists use the term science, they mean we are like the physicists, or we are like chemists, at least. In fact, Larry Summers, the former ubiquitous economist, right? Not only formerly, still ubiquitous economist, former president of Harvard and Treasury Secretary of the US, and Vice President and Chief Economist of the World Bank, and so on, can be relied on to say things that other people will not say. That's a point of pride for him. Sometimes it's hard to tell if he's joking or whether he's not joking. So here's an example. He once said, on the record, if you are a very, very virtuous economist, then you are reborn as a physicist. And if you are a very, very evil economist, then you are reborn as a sociologist. So this may not tell you that he believes this literally. He may not, and I think he probably does not believe this literally, but it does reveal a state of mind. Well, the physicists, the chemists, the biologists, etc., do manage to answer questions, at least certain questions, fairly definitively. It's true that sometimes those questions get reopened, but at least for considerable periods of time, they have, if not forever, they can answer them. The structure of the DNA molecule, for example, is known. It is known. What is the respective role of DNA and RNA? What is the role of environment, if any, in evolutionary processes, and in particular, through its impact on genetic material, is a question that is more controversial. the field of epigenetics has recently enjoyed a certain surge of interest and various findings which suggest that the previous mid to late 20th century wisdom that environmental influences could not affect genetic material that was transmitted is false. So that's a debate which has been reopened. So there are changes, there are variations that take place over time in exactly what is considered to be settled or not settled, what can be discussed as a live question or not. But the structure of the DNA molecule is not one of them. That is a settled question. Are there similar resolutions in economics? I could ask, are there similar resolutions in the social sciences, so-called social sciences generally? And I suspect the answer would be similar. But I'm focusing on economics because the economists have a certain pretense about themselves.
Yeah, the debate of the 20s for a lawyer is a rather recent one. So it would not be very old, you know. The debates in law date back so much before that when we talk about 19th century debates, is still, you know, what we're talking about. We're still participating in that now. It's really, it's a bit different epistemological understanding, I guess, right? Yeah.
Interesting. So you're referring to the debates on legal positivism, for example?
All sorts of things. I mean, the debates about, you know, pacta sunt servanda.
Yes.
That would be as long as, you know, the 11th century.
Right.
and it's still open, really.
Absolutely. So that's a very interesting point.
Yeah.
So law is actually very similar to this. It's similar to economics in this particular respect, or perhaps it admits it more. I suspect it does. Namely, that there are debates which continue over time. Pacta sunt servanda or not.
Yeah.
What is the appropriate stance of courts with respect to contracts? What are the considerations which should be put forward about whether contracts should be respected or not? Whether of a consequentialist kind or whether of a purely procedural kind, having to do with the moral concerns and concerns of legitimacy of the state as the enforcer of these contracts and so forth.
You know, it's interesting because in fact lawyers for a while also were claiming, you know, to be hard scientists.
Yes.
But that was a very specific period, and now anybody would say something like that would be looked upon as a crazy maniac. Whereas economists claim today to be hard scientists.
Today, absolutely.
Yeah, so that's really funny. It's really
absolutely.
interesting.
So in that sense, what I'm suggesting should not be controversial at all, right, in an audience, a more general audience. But it is. And this brings in the question of technocracy, of course, because the reason that it's important for economists to claim that they have certain technical expertise and to often make perhaps overly narrow claims in that regard, to engage in overreach in making the claims that they do, is that provides a very important and powerful justification for the role that they occupy in advising the prince, and not just advising the prince about the consequences of different choices, but about advising the prince very often that there's one particular choice that is most desirable to undertake. Now, let me just elaborate a little bit on this question of the unresolved debates. One way to think about this, and I would like you to help me think about it, because you know more about many of these questions about political economy, certainly insofar as it affects law, which has a similar type of problem attached to it, of course, for the reasons that Unger mentioned, that law is consequential, just as political economy is, as a science of justification, interpretation, and indeed prediction as to how certain kinds of efforts to change the world will actually do so or not. So the issue I want to point to is as follows. There is what I would call a force field which affects the creation, the dissemination, the reception of ideas in the discipline of economics. But this is also, of course, true of law. The force field arises from the fact that there are interests, fundamentally. It arises from the fact that there are interests in relation to ideas. Now, I do not want to be too crude in suggesting that the connection is a one-to-one or a straight-line connection between the existence of certain interests and the prevalence of certain ideas. Though one could make that argument as is sometimes made. The theory of ideology generally is very much about that sort of thing. And I do think that there's very much an ideological content to a number of the dominant economic ideas. But I want to suggest instead that rather than there being a one-to-one relationship between interests and ideas, what we have, even when there are in some sense well-meaning people involved in institutions, and even if we recognize that there's a relative independence of ideas in the sense that young people or old people sitting in a seminar room like this can, in all sincerity, weigh different possibilities and consider them. They're not simple robots or automatons acting out some program, some ideological program. Nevertheless, they are shaped, we are shaped by the existence of interests that influence what ideas are picked up, what ideas are broadcast more loudly or less so, what ideas are disseminated, therefore more powerfully or less so, and retained more so or less so. And what kinds of arguments are viewed as serious or not. Therefore, what underlies hiring and firing and promotion or not in universities, what ideas get picked up in institutions, such as central banks, or indeed any other institution of the society. Now, when you have a force field, then sometimes effects are unpredictable. Right? If I put a series of magnets around a billiard table, and I try to run a steel ball bearing through that magnetic field, the ball bearing may ricochet in different directions. It's not always straightforward. And so similarly with these ideas, there's a direction and there is a tendency. But there are also counterforces. What John Kenneth Galbraith called counterpower is very much at play, too, in certain times and places. And I think one of the things that distinguished the period that has been called by some the golden age of capitalism from 1945 to 1970 or thereabouts, which was the high water mark of social democracy, trade unionism, the social market economy, and so forth, is that the ideas associated with a certain sort of counterpower, even if a modest kind, were given greater importance. The kind of ideas that the economist, who we might call the trade union economist, or the lawyer, who you might call the trade union lawyer or the social democratic lawyer, might espouse. And that also reflected a certain kind of sentiment in which those ideas were ones which one could have and still sustain oneself. On a very material plane, as well as in terms of having an ecology within which one could function, an intellectual ecology and a social ecology in which one could function. So part of what happens with historical shifts from one episteme to another is precisely that it becomes more possible or less possible to sustain certain alternate directions of ideas. That is, in sum, the force field. Without it ever being the case, of course, that one set of ideas is totally vanquished. And you see this in cases such as that of austerity versus stimulus. So you have more and more souped up versions of the debate. Okay? So in the field of economics, for example, that takes the form of more and more technical expertise. Statistics that's seemingly more and more sophisticated being applied. But sophistication of what sort? It's an argumentative tool. So for example, our friends from Bocconi University and Harvard, they use a lot of fancy econometrics, applied statistics, which helps to glorify their argument. So you or I might open it. Happily, I can understand some of it. But we might open this paper and be flummoxed. What does this mean? They're not using ordinary language like David Ricardo or Thomas Malthus did. They're using a souped-up argumentative formulation, which reflects what one might call an argumentative arms race, where in each round you have to sharpen your tools or develop new tools, import the latest tools, which is very much at the center of the culture of the discipline of economics, where the whiz kid, the young Wunderkinder, right, who have arrived on the scene with the latest techniques from the institution where they were trained, are the hot commodity. Because whoever has the latest tools and techniques will win that round of the battle, only to be vanquished in the next round, of course. Right? That's the tragicomic aspect of it, intergenerational tragicomedy. They will then become middle-aged tenured professors and be vanquished in the next round, though a few of them will be lucky enough to win the John Bates Clark Medal for the youngest, the best young economist under 40, and then win the Nobel Prize. And they will help to shape the entire structure of the discipline in this way. Its reigning ideas, and the reigning ideas in some respects of society. Now, so far, I have not mentioned the crash of 2008. I thought I might begin with that, but I didn't, right? I started with, obliquely, perhaps, referring to it only by mentioning the Greek crisis. But the crash of 2008, of course, looms large here in our moment. I won't go on for too long, because I think we'd rather have discussion. But I'll just say some more words, though there are many other themes and topics to bring in. The crash of 2008, of course, is one of those epochal moments in which a big hole was created in this otherwise completely ruptureless skein or sheet. And that hole was blown open by unanticipated events. The justifiers of the reigning wisdom would say unanticipable, but at least unanticipated. Even the Queen of England asked, as some of you may know, to a meeting, I believe, of the British Academy or Royal Economic Society, don't check up which. Why was it not foreseen? Very simple question. Why was this not foreseen? The crisis. And they didn't have a good answer. And then later on, various people wrote sincere screeds to the Queen about why it was not foreseen. But they didn't have an answer. The truth is that some people did foresee it. They were part of these other alternate formations. And we can give example after example, not just Raghuram Rajan and Luigi Zingales, but, and I don't think they're the greatest examples of this at all, though they have been celebrated for it, but many, many other people saw that, for example, derivatives could play a role in systemic instability. There was a guy named Randall Dodd who was arguing this in the mid-1990s. The UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs, the Bank of International Settlements, they wrote reports prior to 2008 pointing to the real estate bubble which existed in many countries and the likelihood of a meltdown related to the mortgage market. And as you know, in the private sector, some people made bids, made bets rather, that such a thing would happen, and they made a lot of money. That's the ultimate test, as Deirdre McCloskey says. If you're so smart, why aren't you so rich? It's a very American question. If you're so smart, why aren't you rich? So some people can say I am rich because I was smart. I bet in the right way, right? Because of my knowledge of the situation, foreknowledge of the situation. So it's not true that it was not anticipated. It was just not anticipated by the people who were paid to anticipate it, by and large, namely the economists, right? And why was that? Innumerable reasons I don't have to go into because you know. Any of you who have been reading the newspapers know. For example, that they had no idea of the microstructure of the economy. The economists who were supposed to know about the economy had no idea about the relevant microstructure of the economy. Meaning, for example, that there exists a thing like collateralized debt obligations. The number of economists who actually knew that is vanishingly small, let alone that there could be potentially some system destabilizing aspect to such a thing. Vanishingly small. They didn't even know. They preferred to operate on a plane which was rarefied, elegant, detached, aerial. Whereas the lawyers did know, because the lawyers design these things and they work in law firms where it's their bread and butter to make these things. Unfortunately, the lawyers who do that, by and large, don't think about what they're doing in terms of the macro scale, unfortunately. So there was a gap between the macro implications and the micro knowledge possessed by the people who were doing these things, with some exceptions. Right? And the people who were supposed to have the systemic view, they didn't. And they didn't because they were paid to celebrate globalization, financialization, right? And all the good things it brought about with it. Risk reduction through risk spreading, quite the opposite of what was the case, but that's what they were paid to celebrate. Poverty reduction, I work on global poverty estimates, so I know that there's a big question mark about that. But they were paid to celebrate the great poverty reduction that had been brought about in the world due to globalization, financialized globalization. In one country, China. Not in every country in the world. China drove everything, right? And they were paid to say, and many of them did and do, poverty is what matters, not inequality. Inequality is a matter of indifference. When I was doing my PhD in the 1990s, not so long ago, I remember at one of the prominent US institutions, nobody talked about inequality in the sense that mattered. You would have been laughed out of the room if you started to talk about that. And specifically, I'm talking about inequality between capital incomes and labor incomes. The kind of inequality that Thomas Piketty has been talking about recently, and others. Everybody knows now that that's the big story. The hedge fund billionaires earn giant incomes that come from casino capitalism, or their better knowledge of how to play the casino, or whatever it is, right? And so do lots of other people benefit from the opportunities that globalization and financialization has been brought about. Those opportunities are to increase capital incomes. There are some definitional questions on the margin. What's a labor income? What's a capital income? Is a highly paid CEO getting a high wage? Or if he is selling options, is it a capital income? Okay, definitional problem on the margin. But basically, it's the capital incomes that's the big story. Whereas, I remember, the only type of inequality they wanted to talk about was inter-wage inequality. That people who have college degrees, university degrees, are getting paid more relative to high school dropouts. That was their focus. So it was a very, I would say, structurally limited debate. And if one asks the question in retrospect, why? I can only think of the answer, the reigning ideology made that the case. Now again, I don't want to be reductionist, simplistic, and say it's just a one-to-one connection. No, I want to think and talk about the force field. Now I've gone on for a long time, and there are many, many other themes and issues I would like to introduce, but I think I should end so we can have a general discussion. But I'll say one sentence in conclusion, which is that this situation seems to me, in many ways, reminiscent of the situation which the philosopher John Gray refers to in a book of his called Two Faces of Liberty, and another work of his where he says that, look, there are questions, moral questions, for example, political, philosophical questions about how best to organize our shared life, which are questions which will never be fully resolved. We have a debate about them, and that debate will go on forever. And that is not an embarrassment, it's a condition. It's our circumstance. And all that we can do, generation after generation, is develop the ability to engage in those arguments in a more sensible way. But we must also be aware, as part of that being more sensible, that these are not debates which will ever end. It's part of the permanent diversity of humankind, in value terms, that these questions have arisen, will arise in the future too. In these economic debates, there are some value differences, yes, which undergird the debate. Some differences in what people actually value. Sometimes they claim to value the same thing, but they actually value different things. And that is evident in the different positions that people take. Right? Why are bondholders terribly concerned about inflation? They have an interest in that, which causes them to be so. But they will never say that the reason they're against inflation is that it reduces the value of their bonds. They'll say that it's because old pensioners' value of their pensions will be reduced. And it's because they are such sensitive souls who care about those on fixed incomes that they are against inflation. So, to some extent, you do have value questions which are related to interest and not related to interest, which are involved. But I would say the bigger issue is that as long as there are differences of interest, there will be obfuscation about why certain ideas are put forward, and there will be incentives to hold to certain ideas, to push forward certain ideas. And that's our predicament. That's the predicament of the economists, that's the predicament of the society. We have to learn to live in this predicament, and we have to talk about this predicament. Let me stop there. Thank you. Please.
Well, I think this I'm reading the George Stigler's book,
Please speak up because I cannot understand.
Yes, I read George Stigler's book, Memoir on Regulate Economist.
George Stigler.
Yes, in his autobiography, he mentioned that economics as a science now is more technological, but economics itself actually is so influenced by the political opinions and also political environment. The best example is monopoly. The economics of monopoly, because monopoly itself actually is not just an economic issue. I think it's really interesting because you mentioned about incentives to become technological, to give a justify the predicament. But also I'm very interested in that the counter incentives is really, really important. You didn't mention very much. Of course, you mentioned about the counter problem, but what about the counter incentives in the environment that encourage the economic science to be so technological and to justify the predicament for the currents, the state? So I would like to discuss a little bit about counter incentives in an environment that help to economic science to develop the problem.
Counter incentives.
Yes. So another incentive to lead economic science into a different trajectory, much more healthy. Yes. That's a question. Another question is about the narratives. As you said, narratives with, I think the narratives, different interests use different narratives to couple the interests, like different arguments, as you said, in the society. I think it's very interesting after the financial crisis because we see fund managers and big lawyers for big law firms and make a lot of money. But also it's very interesting to look at people's psychology actually. People will care about that because if we restrict them, maybe our interest, our money cannot get more gain. We want to give them freedom to make money in the financial markets. But also we worry about that. And we want to regulate, but actually we have psychology that we worry about our gain. So that's kind of the dilemma for the public actually. So how do you think about it? Yes, these questions.
Did you want to add anything about law?
Yeah, no, just I'm a little. Of course, I like your picture and I understand very well where you're going, but. Where are the institutions there? Because it is not like just because in the golden years of capitalism, kind of people were more open to listen to oddballs, kind of, as a matter of being, mentally open. It was about the fact that critical thinking was biting, and was biting because there were an alternative to capitalism out there. And so a lot of that period in geopolitical terms, at least in the discipline I'm interested in, which is law, clearly a lot of the legal innovation that was giving some of the capital back to the labor was driven by the fact that governments in the West was terrified by the workers' movement that were emboldened and empowered by Stalinism. And I'm using the word Stalinism and not socialism just to show you that that it was a political structure that was strong enough in terms of a state capitalist model that could oppose the idea of the free private market model. And so it was, in a way, it was a different kind of capitalism. It was another capitalism against capitalism, all of that. But still, we were into very clear institutional constraints. So today, it seems to me that economists work outside of any institutional constraint. there is no sort of visible or foreseeable political alternative in the sense of the structured institutions. All the political alternatives are deinstitutionalized so far. Haven't been, they are in the forms of social movements, in the forms of, all sort of a variety of popping up from the bottom up and not structured yet. And so in the absence of an alternative institutionalization, the current state of affairs is such that, you go for a very easy and nice career in a top university if you follow, what you were talking about. And nobody's really worried about the fact that, what you're saying was pretty ridiculous, this idea that then you get them the prize and then you go up there and then you reproduce the system of the selection of the elite. Because the system doesn't really need that kind of elite. It's not it just needs to say that we have some sort of intellectual engagement going on. But if you say the kind of thing you just said, he said something like that a little more directly perhaps to a guy that then fortunately became a minister in Italy at the Trento conference, a festival a few years ago. I've never been invited anymore by Boeri and by those that are considered the left of the economists in this country. Because I just said that economists will eventually say whatever is supposed to be said by those that pay their salaries, which is pretty plain, materialistic analysis of the context, but that is taboo. Right. So I wonder where do you see some sort of an institutional alternative kicking in at some point, or whether we are just, seeing this repeating but as some sort of a natural event.
Absolutely. So, Will, if you don't mind, I'll take that question. Right. So, I think this is a fantastically interesting and important question. So, obviously, institutions are at the heart of it. We don't have free-floating ideas that are created by people in abstractio. It doesn't exist. Yeah. They come up in institutions, circulated in institutions. As Marx says very explicitly and interestingly, even ideas are the product of blood, brain, and brawn. So you have to have a material dimension so that people have to get paid salaries, etc., to justify their acting in certain ways, thinking in certain ways. Even if it's not a professional intellectual class, there has to be an enabling atmosphere. Right? We're in the city of where Gramsci had many of his experiences. There was an enabling atmosphere in Turin for certain kinds of ideas to be produced and circulated. Piero Schaeffer, also a son of Turin, I believe, when he went to Cambridge, he used to have talks with Ludwig Wittgenstein, the philosopher, and Wittgenstein loved talking to Schaeffer. He didn't like talking to anyone else in Cambridge. He talked a little bit to Keynes, he talked to one or two other people. The only person he really loved talking to was Schaeffer. So every day he would like to go for an afternoon walk with Schaeffer. And Schaeffer, however, was not as interested in talking to Wittgenstein. So he tired of it at a certain stage, and he said to Wittgenstein, "I'd like to stop going on these daily walks." And Wittgenstein pleaded with him. He said, "Please, I would love to go to continue this. We can talk about anything you want." And Schaeffer said, "Yes, but in your way." So they stopped walking. That's a slight irrelevance. The point is this: most of the ideas that Schaeffer brought to bear in his conversations with Wittgenstein, Schaeffer thought were very ordinary. Amartya Sen writes about this in an article about Schaeffer, Gramsci, and Wittgenstein. Schaeffer thought they were very ordinary ideas. Apparently, they were ideas that were very common to the left-wing milieu of Italy at that time. And Schaeffer and Gramsci in particular shared a number of ideas which Schaeffer brought to his conversations with Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein thought they were incredibly eye-opening, these ideas, about, for instance, the way in which concepts are related to experience. I just offer this as an example that even though Gramsci was an organic intellectual, not a salaried intellectual, he came up in a context, right, as did Schaeffer, and that mattered to generating certain views of the world. So basically, I agree with you. Yes, institutions, moments, historical and cultural facts that are ambient, which shape people, right, in the process, are hugely important. And so it's quite clear that ideas by themselves at most have some type of dialectical relationship to those facts. They cannot change the world by themselves. Ideas don't beget ideas forever and ever without enabling contexts. At least they become unable to really find a foothold in the world that's large enough to make a difference without those enabling contexts. Now, within the discipline of economics, I can think of an example. I do think of an example which is in my mind very much. In almost every country in the world where neoliberalism in some sense has become important and has reshaped those countries' policies and their societies, there was a parallel battle happening within the economics discipline. And in almost every one of these countries, basically the neoliberal faction won. So I'll give you an example. Mexico, you have a public university, UNAM, large public university, and you have a small private university, ITAM, the MIT of Mexico. Now, ITAM is the center of the neoliberal faction in some sense in Mexican economics. Highly technical, mathematicized, and in fact MIT or Harvard, Princeton trained faculty come back. Their students, by and large, I could be wrong, by and large I think are more from upper classes in Mexico. So they also have a certain worldview in which neoliberal reforms are good because they help business to grow, etc. They see it in their family enterprises and people in their class, how people in their class benefit. And they may also therefore believe sincerely that this is good for all of Mexico. These people in turn occupy the highest stations of policymaking as a consequence of the legitimation which has been given to this set of ideas. And they come from a certain social class. UNAM gets viewed as basically the place where leftovers from the older, incorrect economics happen to still be there and still survive, and they're ignored completely. So there's no vitality there, no effort put into renewing it, reproducing it, encouraging young people to develop other ideas. And it does look, therefore, in certain ways tired compared to the dynamism of a time. So you have a phenomenon happening in the world of ideas within this country, which is partly a reflection, of course, of what's happened in the metropolis, in some sense, which then works very effectively to reshape Mexico, because these people staff the institutions and so on. There's a French sociologist whose work you may know, Marion Fourcade, who's recently been writing about the sociology of the discipline of economics in 3 countries. She looks at France is one of them, the United States is another. That kind of work, it seems to me, is very much needed, precisely to make the connection that was mentioned by Ugo, so that we understand what are these relations in both directions. I'm a little familiar with Italian universities, economics departments, and I know that although Piero Strafo was Italian, those Italian economists who are interested in the work of Strafo or others have basically become very marginal. They're not being reproduced, it's only the very old professors who did once work on that, who just happen still to be around, who are there still, and all of the younger faculty are trained in mainstream economics. So it may be that these are waves which go in different directions. I don't know if you have a response to that.
No, that's just, it seems to me that for a while it worked, this system. In this town it's very clear. We have 2 small institutions of a similar nature.
Yes.
One is the Carlo Alberto that does mainstream Alesina in the board kind of work. They get 5 million euros a year from the funders. And then we have this one. And you know, and we are talking about 1/10% less than that. So, and in the history of Carlo Alberto, you know, what they produced is an imitation of, they invented a medal that they give to under 40 economists. that they're giving to some people coming from these places, and they go to hire professors on the job market in Washington,
Yes.
and they think it's very cool, and they believe that the way to attract good people in the school is to pay them more. It's a completely ridiculous imitation of the already pretty pathetic American academic privatized system, if I can express myself freely. And there is no attempt whatsoever of trying to work out something that has a local list or any sort of so that the capital is paying people that are actually celebrating it has been like that since the times in which Machiavelli was paid by the Medici. It's pretty clear. It's not nothing new that we're seeing.
Absolutely.
What is new here, it seems to me, that there is a generalized understanding by less educated people that this sort of narrative is becoming completely useless. And therefore it seems to me that there might be some space for intellectual, for what started talking about Unger, for total critique that is accompanied by some sort of a political movement behind it. But and this might make the system crumble faster than it seems. But this whole itam ugnam story of Mexico repeats itself pretty everywhere. But on the other hand, tell me something: is it different in the United States?
No,
Don't we have pretty much the same kind of?
Of course. Now, I don't want to disagree with you at all about anything you've said. I agree with it, including the Cold War point that we didn't touch on earlier. But I do think that at the same time, the fact that economists are paid pipers, right, who sing the tune that largely, in some sociological sense, that they're paid to sing, doesn't mean there's no knowledge there either. And that's one of the difficulties with this issue. Take what's happening in Venezuela today. Right? They cannot stock the shelves with toilet paper, and the public is in an uproar as a result. Because they have not thought through the problem of provisioning. They have no economic strategy, basically. They have one in broad terms that well, some people might say, but it's not obvious to me what it is, because what I see is rampant economic chaos, which is blamed on speculators, blamed on imperialists, but looks to me as if it's also the product of some kind of everyday economic mismanagement. And so I would say if you want to really have 21st century socialism in Venezuela, and that's a great idea, then you also have to attend to how to put toilet paper on the shelves. Is that an engineering problem? Is it an economic problem? I mean, is it merely logistics, or is it also about pricing? Is it about something else? I think you do need a kind of expertise there. So I was telling the students earlier, my slogan as a general matter would be not more democracy, less expertise. More democracy, more expertise. So bring the relevant expertise to bear along with the empowered democratic processes. And surely you're right about this.
And you are defining, I'm sorry, if I can hear 1 minute. You are defining expertise as a neutral word, which is not. And possibly,
I don't think that.
And so do expand on that. Which kind of expertise? How do you define technology, and what do you want from it? Is it a neutral word? Is it something that is going to distort the whole of our discussion? Because it is already
I would make a distinction, and perhaps you would too, so you should tell me, but I would make a distinction between technical knowledge and technocratic knowledge. Technique or technical expertise generally, and technocratic conceptions of the world. And I think the problem is with the technocratic conceptions of the world, which is to say, conceptions in which the appropriate vesting of power, of decision-making power or authority, is with those who have a certain kind of technical knowledge, which I think is the effective state of affairs with respect to macroeconomic management. Because the economists very often come in with the mainstream economists, with a highly defined notion of what constitutes good policy. Now, sometimes that's broken up due to some debates which occur within the forum. So, for example, I think Joe Stiglitz is a powerful figure precisely because he is a mainstream economist. He uses the language of neoclassical theory, and he disagrees with the macroeconomic policy prescriptions very often of the Washington Consensus, and he says so. He's bold enough to say so. That is an example of a debate that is internal to a certain kind of technical discourse. He stays well within its rules, and in that way, he helps people who are on the outside who want to say, look, this cannot be simply a question for you to decide, this has to be a question for us, the public at large, to decide, to be more empowered. So that is what I would like.
What would be like in this analysis your vision about, I mean, ultimately is the distinction between revolution and reforms, right? I mean, of course, you know, there was a time in this country in which people that were doing what Stiglitz is doing now, in politics, in labor, in lawyering, that they would be considered traitors of the people and shot, because the idea was that if you work in the direction of reforms, in fact, you're reinforcing the system that is that you're trying to overcome. And so, in the thinking, you know, outside of any idea of violence, the question is there a possibility to, I mean, to me, what you've been talking about and what I've been seeing around myself in my own fellow lawyers is a profoundly corrupt system of professionalization and and expertise that is rotten and corrupt by the cash argument. And therefore, to try to use that stuff, which is something that belongs to the elite, in order to overcome, in a revolutionary way, the system, it seems to me it's very good for, if you are already there and you kind of find yourself pretty fine in your critique, but it's still something that is not going to work in any sort of revolutionary term. So this idea of the more expertise, I want to see the experts not sitting in their offices at Harvard or Yale or even Torino. I want to see the experts understanding the political process and being there and experiencing some of the real life of the society that they are talking about. Otherwise, it's going to become a société du spectacle. There was a very lovely quote by Guy Debord, that I hope you know, in which he said, "I found it as vulgar to be a singer of the spectacle than a singer of the critique of the spectacle." So once you become part of the spectacle, whether you are in favor or whether you are against, you are equally vulgar. So it seems to me that this is a point that should be really considered, right? If you want to introduce a critique that is not just reformist, and then opening to all that kind of stuff.
Excellent. I think this is a very, very crucial point. As you know, Joan Robinson said at some stage, roughly, the most useful purpose to which economics can be put is to rebut bad economic arguments. So that could be one thing. It's completely internal in some sense, right?
Yeah.
But recognizing that these bad arguments have effects. So I want to give an example. I spoke about Venezuela earlier. Let's talk about Bolivia. Okay? So what is going on in Bolivia today, it seems to me, is very interesting from this point of view, and other countries, Andean countries. The idea of buen vivir, living well, something else other than development, has been put forward very powerfully. Something to do with relations between people, relations between, indeed, well-being and commoning, relations between human beings and nature, right? It's not just about growth, it's maybe not at all about growth, maybe, and not about development as conventionally understood, not even human development. It's much more relational, less consequentialistic. And it is coming from there, right? It's not coming from any elite university in the world. The people from the elite universities are hearing about it, wanting to understand it, but they are in the background. It's an alternate conception. Now, what will come out of that in practical terms that's beneficial for the people of Bolivia, I think is the question. Are there new type of agreements between extractive industries and people in Bolivia that are going to be formed, are being formed? Clearly, yes. Right? We see that already. There are some confusions.
Starting the water movement, I mean, it had a lot of quite a bit. Of course, then it has to be articulated.
Yes.
But it's also, but the system is actually quite. On the other hand, there are material conditions. I mean, our friend Varoufakis, at some point, he kind of in Greece, they stopped paying the salaries to the professors.
Yes.
You'd like to see, for a moment, frozen the salaries to all the economists of the world, and they say, okay, now 10 years of no salary, which you have to earn your living, 10 years, not more than that, just an academic thing. Go out there, open something, do something, get in politics, go in. Those would be different material conditions.
Yes.
But if we keep material conditions as being, so sort of a privileged elite, even if we are critical, we end up being critical from an elitist point of view. This is a big, because there is something in the argument you're saying, well, it's good to talk to the mainstream, so maybe you can change it a little bit. I mean, I do that all the time, but it's a very slippery slope.
Yeah.
It's a very, very slippery
I'm not
slope.
advocating.
Yeah.
I'm not advocating talking to the mainstream so you can change it to the debate. That's not what I'm advocating.
Yeah.
To be clear.
Yeah.
I'm advocating a reflexive understanding on the part of economists and social scientists generally as to what I call our predicament, which is to say the fact that we are born upon by these different forces in the force field, which mean that we are, to use a word you use correctly, corrupted by that, right? Now, how does that work specifically in terms of the cash nexus in each specific case, the spectacle? That's a good question, and it is a form of corruption. As you say, I'm at the epicenter of it in the United States. So I can see that. The media-driven frenzy to do certain things, your latest paper must be circulated to get the maximum number of hits, to get or downloads, or citations, or whatever it is, or better yet, it's quoted in the New York Times. In fact, getting an op-ed in the New York Times is even better than publishing an article, academic article. So there's that media frenzy. Then, as you say, there's the way in which economic rewards go to certain people, sometimes directly due to consultancy-based forms of corruption, sometimes indirectly. Economists, for instance, strangely, bizarrely, they get paid more than other social scientists on average. It's just a fact in the United States and probably worldwide now, sometimes considerably more. If you look at the superstar salaries that the Collegio Carlo Alberto is a reflection of that phenomenon. Superstars, so-called superstars as opposed to others, obscene differences. Right? That was not part of the social democratic order.
Yeah, I agree. But on the other hand, it's also, I think that there is a more radical critique to make about that. If you look at it from the commons perspective,
yes.
Okay.
Yes.
What you have in America, I mean, analyze it in brutal, material, Marxist terms. What you have in America is the younger generation paying the older generation to teach to them. Okay. So the idea is, I'm a student. I pay $50,000 a year to an older guy that will come here and patronize me, telling me for cash the truth that will allow me one day to make other people pay me cash to do that, right? So that's the thing. Whereas what I'm trying to do here is, and what I think should be the model of a commons education, it is the older generation paying the younger generation. It is the older generation that says to the younger generation, you guys are working, we will be working for me in the future. You guys are the ones that can create the civilization of the world. You guys are working hard. You're not going to pay me to work hard. I'm going to work hard with you. I will try to renounce to things for you because you deserve. So I'm richer, you're poorer. The change should be the other way around. This is a concept that is very material, very basic, but would be a complete revolution in the education, in the superior education. Because even at the new school, even at, I mean, we have students there, even at the public school of the University of California, these kids pay $57,000 a year to pay salaries to people like me. Okay? That's what each one of them. Okay, so
I agree with you.
So this is the structural thing.
I applaud what you're doing, but I don't see what it has to do with the problem at hand. So perhaps you can elaborate a bit more.
No, you don't think that it has something to do with what then they get taught?
No, I'm just not sure what it has to do with my lecture. I agree with everything you said.
But well-being, once you shift from having to being.
Yes.
I thought that was, but anyway.
Yes.
That's fine. But
I agree with everything you said, and I applaud what you're doing here. I think that it's a wonderful thing.
No, it's not going to succeed, but it's an experiment. That's out of the question. It's not, but it's an attempt to make people think conceptually in a different way. And to make people think conceptually in a different way, you have to make people think differently from the basic material relationship. Because people now in America consider it's natural, and most students do, that they pay to study. Well, it's completely natural, I pay to study, I have a service, I pay.
I think that's changing because, and I just say this as an ethnographic observer, that's all I am in this context. It's changing because the level of demand is becoming unbearable in the US higher education system. And as you know, it's happening in the UK, right? The amount that people have to pay in the UK now is approaching American levels at the elite institutions. It's happened all over the world to different degrees, but in the US it's unbearable for many, many people. So I think that it will sooner or later have to collapse as a consequence. Yes.
Okay, so are there more questions? Or?
I never responded to Will, so I want to answer him because he asked the first question.
Yeah, do you mind if I have to run?
Please feel free.
Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure and honor that you take.
Thank you so
much.
much.
So I feel that because Will is a student and he asked the first question, but I didn't give him the first answer, I must answer this question. So he asked about two things: counter incentives, dilemmas of regulation, etc. So I think we already talked about counter incentives quite a bit, right? In some sense. So let me just not go into that. Dilemmas of regulation, very interesting. So you were pointing out that sometimes the general public might also not like some of the regulations which are meant to safeguard their interest.
Yes.
Because it seems to be harming their interest in another way. For example, finance. They may not like you to do things to cool the building up of an asset bubble because they're also speculating in real estate, right?
Yes.
Or speculating in stocks, even middle class people, like in China, right?
Yes.
So for example, if you are already own some stocks, maybe only a small amount, you want the stock market to keep going up. And if the central bank or the government does something to cool the market so as to avoid collapse of the bubble, resulting bubble, they might seem to you, as the small stockholder, to be acting against your interest.
Yes, paradox.
Absolutely. I think it's a real question. And I think that, again, this is an example of why you need justification. You need argument. You need explanation. Right? It's not enough for the central bank to just do what it does. It has to explain. And to some extent, they have understood that due to narrow technical reasons. Right? They publish their minutes. The U.S. Federal Reserve publishes what is called the Federal Open Market Committee minutes. You can download them on your computer now. Okay, for the minutes for previous meetings of the Federal Open Market Committee, where you can see who said what. Now, why are they doing that? They're not really doing that for the general public. They're doing that for their public, for the bondholders, people who are generally engaged in financial sector activities, who want to understand how they should better speculate. But it is more generally true that if financial sector regulation is going to encompass what's called macroprudential regulation, which means take seriously when an asset bubble is building up, try to do something to cool it, right? Which previously central banks didn't consider part of their aim, but post-2008 it's come to be considered one of the goals that they should have, then I think that too is an example of something that should be communicated with the general public and get the endorsement of the general public. So I view this as a terrain where politics, economics, and ethics or political philosophy do resolutely come together, because only if there is such communication will there be perceived legitimacy. That's a sociological point, right? Perceived legitimacy, which will in turn provide a real sanction for the organizations in question, central bank or financial regulators who do it. But it's also a question of real legitimacy, moral and political legitimacy.
Yes.
So I'm a reformist. Reformist revolutionary maybe, but I'm not a revolutionary simpliciter, revolutionary as such. Please, Alaji, yes.
Yeah, thank you. I want to turn the discussion a little bit, of course, on the same subject matter called the well-being, if you like.
Yes.
You know, when we look at well-being in moral philosophy, in my senses of the view, it means non-instrumental and ultimate good for a person. But now, when we look at in the utilitarianism perspective of the term well-being, we see that well-being is described and defined by the market or the political activists. But now, these definitions should stand the public. They look at what our living status as compared to the poor and the rich. The well-being of a person is defined by the market. Is that democratic? The well-being of Africans is defined by the West, in the sense that they are looked at what is available to them as compared to what is available in the West. And this is the definition that defines what is a developed country and what is not a developed country. My confusion is, do we have a fair institution that looks at what is a well-being, because it is an independent perspective, it is an independent idea. What is well-being for me might not be the appropriate definition that we accept as a universal definition. So do we have institutions that look at these differences in providing resources to different people at different needs? A well-being for a disabled person, like in the animal farms of George Orwell's, all animals are looked as equal, but others are more equal than the others. In this sense, do we have institutions that look at these differences in economics and in ethics?
I think you have to look at them as a citizen or as someone intervening in these debates. You know, more than 50 years ago, 60 years ago, a famous economist, Ragnar Nurkse, wrote a book where he referred to something called the international demonstration effect. This was the early 1950s. The international demonstration effect is where the middle classes or the upper middle classes in poor countries seek to emulate the pattern of consumption of rich countries. So he had in mind, for example, the elites in Brazil, let's say, or in Venezuela or in Mexico, who want to live like people in America, and therefore import the same cars, try to wear similar clothes, build houses in a similar fashion, use air conditioners, etc., etc., right? Now that description of the international demonstration effect, which he thought then is applying to a small sliver, clearly applies to a much larger proportion of humanity today, right? You can go to the Gambia, as you know, to Banjul, and see the international demonstration effect in operation, right? And all those tourists that come back and forth, they also bring that as one of the pollutants that they bring to the Gambia. At the same time, one can see that these are legitimate aspirations in some sense that people have. There are legitimate aspirations, right? That's one of the reasons they're crossing into Europe in such numbers and elsewhere. And one cannot say that people should not have those aspirations at all. I have no answer for you, Alex. I have only to say that this is a debate we must have about how we should live, commoning, how we should live. It's not a debate about how I think the wrong way to understand the problem is in terms of one group or one person or one institution or one process imposing its values on another. Okay, I don't think that the market as an abstraction defines anything. I don't think it tells us to do anything. I think that in the end, we, as human beings, react in different ways to the stimuli that we individually receive, and in our relations with one another, we imagine what it is to live well, or live better, or live worse. That's where the discussion has to be at. Buen vivir, live well, how to live well, right? Whether you're in the Gambia, or you're in Turin, or in India, or New York, that has to be the question. So I have no answer for you. I don't think that the market imposes anything on you. I think that you and we together have to discuss how to live. So I think we could end there unless there's another question or comment. Jacqueline, you want to comment?
Yes. My question is about the characteristics or the content of the economics, this word itself, because today we are talking about the role of the economics. But in my logic, I think the role of economics maybe is based on the content of the economics, this word itself. Because in our economic theory class, we learned that Adam Smith first raised the basic assumptions of the economics, which is the word of the Howlish and the rational. And then John Mueller generalized this word further, and then the Marshall added two factors to this new word. One is the utility maximization, and the other one is the perfect rationality. And I just want to ask, in our case, we pay more attention on the public interest, and what new factors will be added to the word economics itself by the professors that
The hardest questions. I think it's very difficult, Jacqueline, to answer that. I would say, look, as we discussed a bit in the class, the conception of rational agency is being, I think, should be widened at a bare minimum. So, for example, behavioral economics, not something I particularly embrace, but behavioral economics as a subfield has become very popular in the last 30 years, 20 years especially, due to its role in showing that many of the ways that rationality was understood previously are basically wrong in this, as descriptions of what people actually do. They don't provide correct descriptions. What people actually do is often very different from what the ascription of rationality to them would suggest that they would do. Right? For instance, they are much more likely to be myopic, to not see the distant future when they make decisions, to only look at what's in the near future, for example. Now, this has gone some distance to changing our understanding of economic agents, but it seems to be part of what has to be done. On the reading list, I didn't have much chance to talk about it in the last few days, there's a couple of articles by Amartya Sen, which are on the idea that people oftentimes have reasons to do things that mainstream economics would think of as being irrational. There are certain social norms, for example, which if people have reason to abide by them, would lead them to do things that look very strange, hard to explain from a mainstream economist's point of view. And he gives examples. For instance, if you have the social norm that you must not take the biggest piece of cake, even though you love cake, because it would be rude to take the biggest piece, you should always take the second biggest piece or the third biggest piece. And if you act according to that social norm of never picking the biggest piece, then you'll end up over time doing things that seem to be contradictory or irrational from a mainstream economist's point of view. It's a simple example, but it's an example of how thinking of rationality more broadly as having good reasons to do what you do, which is a richer understanding of what rationality is, will lead you in a different direction than thinking about rationality as how economists have interpreted consistent choice. Okay. Then there's, of course, the deeper question, which is that the rest of the world knew, since Sigmund Freud at least, that there's a thing called the unconscious and that not everything that we do is fully understood by us, our rational selves. So sociology understands that a little bit. Psychology certainly understands that. Anthropology understands that a little bit. Perhaps the law maybe understands it a little bit because it does have tests for mental competence, for example, in criminal law. But economics does not understand this. Seemingly, in mainstream economics, completely erases the concept of action, agency, choice that is driven by unconscious desires, for example, for consumption or for anything else that might be relevant to economic behavior. So that's another area where you need to really have a profound, I think, revision in our understanding of who people are as economic actors in order to be more realistic. That's being more scientific. And to draw that in, it's not scientific to pretend that that doesn't exist and develop a whole mathematical edifice as if it doesn't exist. What would be scientific would be to take those facts in hand and build on them, it seems to me. So these are among the directions that one could imagine going, specifically taking the example of rationality.
Okay, what do you say?
Thank you all for a very nice. Thank you for coming. French sociologist. The name has just escaped me in a second.
Sì, ce l'ho.
So he actually abandons me and I don't leave.